Now, as South Africa tries negotiating a shifting global trade landscape, new alliances may emerge that could redefine Africa's future. One such partnership is the China-Africa Economic Partnership Agreement, and it's being hailed, at least in some quarters, as a game changer, promising increased trade, investment and infrastructure development. But what exactly does this agreement entail, and could it be used to offset the impact of the US's looming tariff imposition on South African exports? Let's try and unpack this with our guest. Dr Emmanuel Matambo is a research director at the China-Africa Center at the University of Johannesburg and joins us now via our video link. Doc, it's lovely to have you on the program. Thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. And we decided to have this discussion off the back of a question that was actually posed yesterday when the two ministers gave that joint briefing around why South Africa just doesn't open the floodgates, so to speak, to China in response to what Washington is planning to do. Is it as simple as that?
Good morning, and good morning to your many viewers and listeners. Well, it is not as simple as that. First of all, of just the unpredictable nature of the United States under President Donald Trump. Now, there is obviously hope that in the long run, this might just be something, the current unpredictability could be a fleeting episode, so to say, in South Africa's long-standing trade with the United States of America. To just throw the baby with the bathwater might be a bit myopic on the part of South Africa. So that is why probably South Africa has been trying in as much as it can to try and salvage the relationship that it has had with the United States. So obviously, in the long run, when you look at international relations from a more broader perspective rather than trade in itself, South Africa would probably be betting on the fact that after 4 years, this might change. But we have noticed, though, that a lot can change in the Trump administration. A case in point is Lesotho, for example, which was hit with some of the highest tariffs by the United States, not only in Africa, but in the world. But that has been revised down to 15% over the last several months or so to say. So that is why South Africa has been very cautious not to be very disruptive when it comes to its relationship with the United States, but to play a more level-headed role, so to say, than has been the case from Washington.
Fair enough. It sounds like the prudent thing to do. I can't help but wonder, though, how much of the damage perhaps could have been done on the other side of that 4 years. And as you answer that question, Doc, perhaps you can help us also dress down this China-Africa Economic Partnership Agreement. It's a bit of a mouthful, but broadly speaking, what does it entail?
Well, it comes on the back of what has been happening in global supply chains. First of all, we will see that obviously it will be between China mostly and African countries that have formal relations with the People's Republic of China. It should also be read in the context of what came out in June, when South Africa's relationship with the United States seemed not to have recovered since that May 2025 meeting between President Ramaphosa and President Donald Trump. We saw that China stepped into the breach, so to say we're actually going to remove the tariffs that emanate from Africa. It's about 53 countries from Africa, those that hold relations with China. Now, this will kind of soften the blow that might be inflicted on the African continent by the trade tariffs that we see from China. But I have to add that in as much as it gives the African continent some respite in its trade relations, global trade relations, we should also emphasize that the need for Africa to beneficiate its exports to the rest of the world still stands, even if China offers it a breathing space, so to say, through this agreement.
I know there's also real concerns about whether or not, this agreement actually allows countries on the continent to industrialize. We know that typically we'll export raw materials and China will, in exchange, try to sell us finished products. But in the long run, if you're trying to build industries and bolster your ability to, stand such decisions from Washington, you need to essentially be able to stand on your own. And I don't know if this agreement goes far enough insofar as that is concerned.
Well, in spirit, it seems to lead towards that way, the beneficiation of Africa's exports to China, and obviously value addition in terms of what the continent takes out of its grounds, and on top of its grounds as well. So that is an inescapable facet of Africa's future trade relationships, not only with China, but with the rest of the continent as well. So in as much as the spirit of the agreement might allude towards that fact, I'm not very confident that in the immediate present, the African continent is ready for that. We still cannot escape the fact that our industrial capacity remains grotesquely anemic, and that we do not derive, because of that, we do not derive a lot of revenue from the exports that we make to the rest of the continent. And that is why even our approach to China should not just be a knee-jerk reaction. It should be something that has a long-standing imperative, and that long-standing imperative is to industrialize the continent, to deepen our intra-African trade. That is why yesterday it was heartening when President Cyril Ramaphosa was closing off the National Executive Committee meeting of the African National Congress, when he emphasized the fact that South Africa should remain committed to the African Continental Free Trade Area, because that will help the continent not only to industrialize, but also to entrench intra-African trade, and that will soften the blow that might come with the unpredictable nature of global supply chains, as has been the case with the United States of America.
Yeah. I find it interesting that you say it was heartening to hear the president speak about that, because I know of a few commentators who I imagine were rolling their eyes, only because they've grown to be a bit pessimistic, Doc, and I think there's perhaps reason for that. This agreement, the African Continental Free Trade Area, was ratified in 2018. I struggle to find tangible examples of it being enforced, at least in the way in which it had been envisioned. And so one wonders how much longer we can continue punting this game changer of an agreement before, ultimately conceding that perhaps we don't have the governance structures in place. Perhaps there are just so many other impediments to, this agreement seeing the day of light in the way in which it had been planned.
Well, the African Continental Free Trade Area cannot just give the continent the benefits that it envisages overnight. And it has to be read, by the way, in tandem with Agenda 2063 of the African Union, which has a longer-term vision. The same applies to the African Continental Free Trade Area. Africa's trade amongst African countries today still hovers below the 20% mark. So if people are expecting overnight rewards from the African Continental Free Trade Area, then I'm sorry, they're going to be inevitably disappointed. But what we should not do, though, is just wallow in despair and totally discard the intent of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Obviously, it needs a lot of impetus, it needs a lot of support from African governments, from African private sectors as well. We should also wean ourselves from this long-standing welfareist instinct of Africa, thinking that governments are there to foster employment, for example. We need to make sure that we bolster the role of the private enterprises as well, in terms of job creation, value addition, and the creation of employment at a general scale. So yes, the African Continental Free Trade Area should be read in the perspective of a lot of initiatives that have failed in the past, such as the Lagos Plan of Action in terms of integrating the continent. Yes, those have failed, and probably we should be more measured in our appraisal of the African Continental Free Trade Area. But that should not lull us into a state of despondency where we just give up completely. I think it has a lot of promise in it, subject obviously to how African governments are going to be realistic about making sure that they bring in the private sector into bolstering the continent's economic prospects.
Yeah, all right. You need to borrow us some of that optimism to see us through, Doc. I think that's exactly what we might need during these unpredictable and uncertain times. Dr. Emmanuel Matambo, a great pleasure. Thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Dr. Matambo is a research director with the China Africa Center at the University of Johannesburg.